All right, so without further ado, here you have Randy Olson.
Made it. No, I've already got it. Yeah, that's that here. Okay. Great to be here. Thank you very much. And by the way, Jeremy and Nancy are two of my guardian angels throughout my career. They've helped with all sorts of things, including the publication of my book. Nancy played a pivotal role in that. So, before I even get started, I want to begin with a message from the President of the United States.
The mistake of my first couple of years was thinking that this job was just about getting the policy right. And that's important. But, you know, the nature of this office is also to tell a story to the American people that gives them a sense of unity and purpose and optimism, especially during tough times.
So, that was 2 weeks ago in CBS with Charlie Rose interviewing the president. And he talked about what he thinks is really kind of the fundamental mistake of his first term. And it's his failure to tell a story to the American people. So the first interesting thing to note about what he was saying there is that there was a lot of discussion about that little soundbite there, that he was kind of conceding this was one of his shortcomings. But nobody in any of the discussions that I read online or saw on talk shows ever tore into this word story. Nobody ever said one skeptical word about, well, stories are like, you know, making like Hollywood, like distorting the truth and fantasies and things like that. He's saying that he wants to tell us a bunch of lies. Nobody ever said that in the general public, and that's because stories and storytelling are fairly widely accepted and seen as a valid mode of broad communication. But that's kind of different than the science world, because you won't hear scientists, for the most part, talking about stories and storytelling. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my book in a little while, but the third chapter of my book is about the importance of story and storytelling. And one of the most important reviews written about my book suggested that I was advocating bending the science to tell better stories. That I was saying it doesn't matter, you know, if you have to change the facts or something, just so long as you're telling a good story. Nothing could be farther from the truth, but that was at least one person. That's actually many scientists' perception of what I'm advocating. And it's gotten to the point now where I feel that this is really kind of a valid term, story phobia. And you see this in the science world, the dread fear of stories and storytelling, that you're going to start taking all of our facts and just have fun with them. And the fact is that journalists, you know, day in and day out, report the truth the best of their ability, and they don't change the facts, and they tell good stories. So there's no need for that. But what you see is this aversion to these words in the science world. And you won't even find any textbooks, I think, in the science world that talk about the importance of storytelling. Not yet. But I think what I'm presenting to you here is kind of a sign of things to come in the future, because the world is changing and our communication environment is changing drastically. And here are a group of people that have found out about this the hard way. These are some of the world's top climate scientists who were given the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007 for their work on climate. And yet today, they are all deeply frustrated at their inability to get their, quote, message across to the public. The people just aren't listening to them. And so they end up really with the same situation as Obama. This is the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And they have the same problem. They've done great work, but they've failed to communicate it effectively. Same. And so here is what I'm here to talk to you about this afternoon, evening, in depth, is this topic of storytelling, why it's so important and how it works, more important than anything else, and how it is misunderstood, and why should we be so interested in storytelling? Well, first off, there's just this age-old tradition, as we know, all the way back to the Greeks and the Romans and back beyond that. Thousands of years of this being really the most powerful means of propagating information in our society, the telling of stories, the oral traditions. So we know that over the ages it's very important, but furthermore, there's all kinds of physiological studies nowadays, or scientific studies, neurological studies, looking at the fact that storytelling activates different parts of the brain. If I tell you a whole bunch of facts, one part of your brain will get active. But if I suddenly go into storytelling mode, if I say, once upon a time, there was a little girl walking through the forest, and we have you hooked up to an MRI or even EEG, you'll start to see a different part of the brain activate. And that's part of the dynamic of storytelling. And that's part of the power of it. It really, in some ways, really good storytelling is right on the border of hypnosis. It can be so powerful. And so let me tell you about one good storyteller. I made a movie 6 years ago that I'll mention briefly in a little while about called Flock of Dodos, about the controversy over the teaching of evolution, intelligent design. And at a lot of the screenings, when we have a question and answer session afterwards, people ask me, Carl Sagan was such a great communicator. Who is the next Carl Sagan? Who's the great scientist that's going to get out there and communicate this stuff to the public? And I tell them, you know, first off, the world has kind of changed, but I don't know that I know any scientists that I would call incredible communicators for the broad audience. I mean, here's what we know for the broad audience. People like Ronald Reagan, he was known as the great communicator as a president. He had these skills. He was a former actor. He knew how to present himself. Tom Hanks is a great communicator that everybody wants him to be the spokesperson. And here is also an equally great communicator, Mike Rowe, from a show called Dirty Jobs. Up until a few years ago, the most successful show that Discovery Channel's ever had. And this was a job where he just went around and spent a day working on all kinds of dirty jobs with working class folks. So last year, he was brought into a Senate hearing on labor relations and their concern about, you know, the general public's perception of working class folks these days. And they gave him 5 minutes to talk. And I want to show you two excerpts from the very beginning of his 5-minute talk that he gave to the Senate. And they're both really short, and then after they're over, I'll say a few comments about what we see here. So if you can listen to this. He's just been introduced.
And thank you officially for having me here today. It really is a thrill and an honor. One small thing, the credits for the show are very kind. In truth, I'm more of a guest. I assume the role of an apprentice on Dirty Jobs and for the last 7 years or so.
And here's the second clip.
I can talk certainly at length about any of the people I've met in the show, and I'm tempted to, but I'd rather take a small portion of my 5 minutes and tell you about my grandfather, because he's the reason ultimately that I decided to come here today.
So think about the first clip there, introducing himself to this audience in this very important forum. And did he begin by trying to establish himself as some super impressive guy with all these amazing credentials? Did he mention all of the Emmys that they'd won with this show or anything like that? No, he took the opposite tack. He actually started as low as possible, and he said, look, I'm just an average guy who got lucky and ended up on this amazing TV show. And that becomes a very likable way to begin with. But more importantly, this is one of the fundamental kind of story structures that you see in a lot of big stories, which is the story of ordinary people who end up in extraordinary circumstances. And I'm not sure that he thought about that sort of theory behind what he said, but it falls right into that. He's just trying to say, I'm an ordinary guy and I ended up in this extraordinary circumstance, which is really nice. And then secondly, as he gets ready to launch into what he's going to talk about, does he start with a whole bunch of facts and figures? Does he say a recent poll shows that 50% of Americans think this and that about blue-collar workers? No, to the contrary, what he does is he uses storytelling. And he's only got 5 minutes, and it turns out he uses up 3 of those 5 minutes simply telling the story of his grandfather, who was a plumber, and about the day when their toilet clogged up, and it's a really funny story, and the grandfather came over and fixed the toilet, and comparing that to today when his toilet clogs and he just leaves a check on the counter for the plumber. He never even meets him. It's a great story. When he gets to the end of it, he's got everybody in the palm of his hand through great storytelling. Then he delivers his message, which is recent polls show this and that. So this is part of the instincts of how to use storytelling to connect with the crowd from the outset. I have had a long-term interest in storytelling. I think that was part of what drew me into my science career. And about 20 years ago, as I'll mention in a few minutes, I was a professor at the University of New Hampshire and really starting to get deeper interested in this idea of broad communication of science and topics in general. And I ended up coming up here and shooting a video which aired on main PBS for 2 or 3 years, and then it was 20 years ago last month that we did this in Stonington, and all it was 3 lobster fishermen, 2 brothers, Brian and Stevie Robbins, and their father, and just sat them down and had them tell stories, and they're amazing storytellers. And a couple years ago at the University of Maine, we had an evening where we showed the film 20 years later, and they spoke, and it's on this website, saltthemovie.org, and it's not a spectacular piece of filmmaking. I didn't even know what I was doing as a filmmaker, but it's amazing storytelling. The stories that they tell are very well told, well structured, and fun and easy to follow. It's worth checking it out. So every good story really needs at its core a source of tension or conflict, namely in the form of a question. So I'm going to try and somewhat tell you a story throughout this presentation, and this is really what's at the core of it, is this question: can scientists be good storytellers? We know that they have this aversion to storytelling, but we know that storytelling is important, and we know that somebody like President Obama is being told right now, you've got to engage in this. You can't stay above it. You've got to come down and connect with people through the telling of stories. So can scientists do this, given the urgency that they have now in terms of trying to connect with the public and communicate more effectively? So this is something I've gotten deeply involved with now. And one of the things that I do is, for the last 5 years at big science meetings, we have scientists send us their 5-minute short videos that they're making. And I put together a panel. We pick 10 of them. And the panels consist of myself and 2 of my filmmaker friends from Hollywood. And we sit there for 3 hours, and we show each video, and we talk about them and point out. And the fact is, none of them tell stories. And I'll get into that. But that's the first thing you begin to observe when you have scientists make films. They don't tell stories. This is how it generally works. The 3 of us are on a panel. It's a little hard to see that probably. But this is one of the filmmakers up here looking annoyed at me as we're giving her comments about her film. But actually, it's very constructive, and they enjoy it a lot. And I tell you about this because one of the films that we got this past year that I didn't even put in the workshop, but the more I've thought about this film, I really love it because it brings to life the whole problem of scientists and storytelling. So what this is about is I used to be an oceanographer, and one of the things you do in oceanographers is you go out into the ocean and you take expensive equipment and you throw it overboard and you leave it for 1 or 2 years sometimes. So that's what's going on here. This is a very expensive, this could be hundreds, maybe thousands of dollars, maybe even $1 million of equipment inside this. There's an anchor at the bottom, and there's a couple here, and then there's a float up there. So you throw it over the side of the ship. Sometimes it'll go all the way down 2 miles down, and you'll come back maybe 2 years later. And when you come back, you'll send a sound signal from the ship all the way down to this thing, and there's what's called an acoustic couple there. And when it hears that sound signal, the bottom part releases, and the whole float goes all the way up to the surface, and you retrieve it, and you've got your $1 million piece of equipment, and you've got 2 years worth of data, assuming it actually comes back. Therein lies the challenge. I have been out on ships and watched grown scientists on their knees on the deck praying that this thing actually will surface, and that it hasn't either failed with the equipment or gotten tangled up by the fisherman's net down there, which happens all the time. If that happens, you've lost $1 million worth of gear and 2 years worth of data, and your career will be damaged from that. What a great dramatic moment to use for storytelling. Imagine setting this up and then forcing the audience to wait for a half an hour wondering this question: did they get it or not? And while I'm waiting to give you this, I've got the answer here, but I'm hiding it from you. And while I'm waiting to give you the answer, I tell you all about what's inside this thing and all the research and why we're doing this, blah, blah, blah. So this guy sends in this 5-minute video that's about that whole thing, only he's a scientist. And what do you think his video does? The first minute tells about going out there, and then the guy says, and sometimes these things don't release and they don't surface. But today it released just fine, and it popped up and we took it and put it on the ship. And he spends the next 4 minutes telling you about the data that's inside the thing, rather than doing what a storyteller would do, which I just said, which is set it up and then play this game where we hold the answer away and keep you intrigued. And that's what scientists hate. They hate to play games like that. They just say, look, if we got the answer, why don't we just give it to you now? Well, I don't want to play some game and hide the answer away from you. There's your fundamental divide between scientists and storytellers. Scientists don't like to engage in these games, but they need to more and more. And furthermore, this is a great article that was in January this year in the New Yorker that really is parallel to what I'm talking about here. It's called Streaming Dreams by John Seabrook. And what it's about is that later this year, YouTube is going to try and go into competition with mainstream television and think they can steal away a third to a quarter of the audience of TV viewers by launching 20 channels, each of which is going to have a celebrity attached to them. But this article questioned the fundamental dynamic of TV viewing versus watching stuff on YouTube and on the internet. The internet and television are completely different worlds. What you have on television, when people plop down on the couch to watch TV and they turn it on, they're not looking for information for the most part. Sometimes they might go to the Weather Channel or something, but in general, they're just looking for something that's going to hold their interest, and that's why you start channel surfing like, oh, that looks interesting. Well, the way you get people interested in it is you start telling them a story, and you hide that answer away, and they get annoyed with you, but they keep watching because what's the answer to this thing, you know? Who done it? You're telling a murder mystery. But the internet is the opposite. People go to the internet not to have games played with them. You know, imagine if you went to Google and tried to search for something and started asking all these questions, playing a game with you. We've got all your links. We're not going to give it to you. First, you got to answer these questions. They do that sometimes. It's annoying. And so there's the fundamental difference, is that the internet versus television. In the internet, it's about making information abundant, giving you everything you want for information. On television, it's about entertainment and making the information scarce. It's a fundamental divide, and that's the same divide between scientists and storytellers. A storyteller is trying to make the information scarce and play this game. Scientist just wants to give it all to you. So, good storytelling it's really about three things. It's about grabbing the interest of an audience, taking them and by posing a question, a source of tension or conflict that they want to hear the answer to, and they're not going to leave till they get that answer, then taking them on a journey as we explore all these possible answers to it, and then finally giving them the answer. So three things: grabbing interest, taking you on a journey, and paying it off at the end. So good storytelling is about taking an interesting journey. If I tell you the story of me sitting here for 2 days in this room doing nothing, that's not going to be nearly as interesting as if I go out and walk around for 2 days. It's about an interesting journey. So towards that end, let me tell you about my journey, which is somewhat interesting. In my career, I have undergone this journey from point A to point B. I started as a scientist. I became a filmmaker, is what I am now. So it began for me as an undergraduate at the University of Washington studying marine biology. I ended up doing my graduate work at Harvard University, but working on coral reefs around the world, in particular in Australia. I lived on this island for an entire year studying coral reef ecology, and went back to Australia studying this crown of thorns starfish problem on the Great Barrier Reef, and eventually became a professor down the road at the University of New Hampshire in the late 80s, and even achieved tenure. But during those years, I began to get more and more interested in this topic of the broad communication of science and environmental issues, until finally, right about the time I got tenure, my entire world turned sideways. I had major epiphany, revelation, and ended up resigning, moving to Los Angeles, entering into film school at the University of Southern California, going through the 3-year film production program, and then eventually getting out of film school in the late 90s and setting to work as a filmmaker, and ending up for about 5 years, what I call the lost years, where I really can't even recall what I did for those 5 years, is trying to get going as a filmmaker, and then eventually connected with this fellow, Dr. Jeremy Jackson, who was supposed to be here tonight and will be here for future events, who was one of my heroes from the world of marine biology. And together we put together a project called Shifting Baselines, which was combining my filmmaking skills with these ocean conservation issues and drawing on the Hollywood resources that I had. We began making a series of short films and television commercials, and we had a lot of success. I did basically the most successful public service announcement in the history of ocean conservation, a spot that I did called the Ocean Symphony with a bunch of comic actors, including Jack Black and Henry Winkler and Tom Arnold and a whole bunch of other folks. But that got me deeper into this topic of communicating science. And by then, I'd been not only through film school, but also through a very intense acting program for 2 years. And I had a whole bunch of new thoughts in my head that were coming not from the science world, but from the world of humanities, really, what I'd gotten in film school. By 2006, I made this movie called Flock of Dodos. It premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival. It was on Showtime for 2 years. You can watch it on Netflix now. It's on streaming, which is a lot of fun. It's about the controversy around the teaching of evolution versus intelligent design, but it's also in large part about the inability of scientists to communicate their message effectively. And this is when I really started to get into it. I followed that 2 years later with a mockumentary about global warming called Sizzle, which was really having some fun with this topic. And then it all came together in 2009 with this book that Nancy mentioned, Don't Be Such a Scientist, Talking Substance in an Age of Style. And this was kind of the manifesto where I brought together these two worlds, all that I had learned in not just the filmmaking, but more importantly, the acting classes, and combining that with this dynamic of how to communicate science. It was published in 2009, became popular in the science and environmental world, but big surprise to me, it also has become popular in the public health world. So now I work with a lot of public health groups. I'll mention in a moment one of them. So this brings us back then to this topic of storytelling. And the central chapter of my book was about storytelling. It's called Don't Be Such a Poor Storyteller. And I have kind of gotten deeper into this journey of trying to understand how story works with scientists and why they have such a hard time with it. And here's one of the first revelations, is that so many people, not just scientists, don't even know what a story really is. I was at a public health workshop a month ago and listened to these two people running a storytelling workshop, and it was clear to me they didn't even know what a story is. What is a story? A story is something that begins when something happens. So a bunch of facts are not really a story. This first dawned on me about 3 years ago when the people at the Centers for Disease Control read my book and invited me to come down there and spend a day. So in preparation for that, I began talking with some of their top communicators. And one woman told me that She said, here's what happens with us. We go and sit down with the scientists, and we ask them, what do you think we should communicate to the public about, the Centers for Disease Control? And almost in unison, the scientists say, we want you to tell the story of the CDC. And the communicators say back, well, great, but what is the story of the CDC? And the scientists say, they throw their hands up and say, come on, it's all the people that work here, it's the equipment we have, the projects, the diseases that we cure, all these amazing accomplishments. And the communicators say, that's nice, but that's not a story. That's exposition. That's information. That's the beginning of a story. If I try and tell you the story of a murder mystery, I will begin by telling you a bunch of facts about a little town in Maine and the people that live there and one family and the father and the mother, but that's all just facts. Story is when something happens and we begin to tell a story, and we're going to get into this in a little more depth here. So, as I said, stories have a very clear, at the simplest level, structure, 3 acts, beginning, middle, and an end. And they begin with this information, exposition. And this is the problem that scientists rarely get beyond exposition. But eventually, after you've laid out a few facts, then something happens, and when that something happens, it poses a question. The classic simple story is a murder mystery. We get to know a bunch of people, we get to know the family, the mother, father, a couple kids, and then finally something happens. We find the father laying dead in the living room. Now we've got a question, who done it? And it's your typical murder mystery, and now we go on this journey to try and figure out who done it. So, how do you start a story? As I say, a story begins when something happens. If I ask you, tell me the story, quote, story of your childhood, and all you start doing is itemizing things, well, let's see, I grew up, I went to junior high school here and high school here, and did this. That's not a story yet. And people like to think of it as a story. It becomes a story if you say, I went to junior high school and I was in 7th grade and having a good time, and then I was in an accident and both my legs got cut off. Well, suddenly we've got a story, like, how did you deal with that? What happened from there? And this is the basic dynamic of the way a story works, which is it's basically about taking, and this is just theory straight out of Hollywood screenwriters in telling stories, and this comes from Joseph Campbell, who's kind of the founding guru of studying stories and over mythology and things, called The Hero's Journey. And he talks about a story as being like a circle, very simple. We start a story here, we go in this circle, and we start it off in an ordinary world where everything is calm and normal, and then something happens, and we switch into what's called the special world. And the whole time we're over here, all we're doing is trying to get back to here. So we've got this tension here, this question, whatever, and this whole journey is an effort to try and get back to there. Think about The Wizard of Oz. What goes on there? Dorothy is stuck in this ordinary, boring, black and white world out in the prairies, and suddenly a tornado comes along, sweeps her up, and now she's in a special world, and she spends the whole rest of the story trying to get herself back to the ordinary world. That's the basic fundamental dynamic, and it actually works with the telling of science. It can work. If I tell you about all the starfish along this coast here spawn in the fall, that's the ordinary world. You go out there, there's a typical starfish. When it reproduces, it spawns in the fall. And we're here in the ordinary world. Everything's normal. And then suddenly I say, but there's one species that spawns in the spring. Suddenly, I've upset your world. Things are not right. Well, why does that spawn in the spring? We pose this question. What's going on? And you're not really going to be comfortable until I take you on this journey of all these different ideas that plan for that. And finally, I give you the answer. And then we're back to this norm. Oh, now it all makes sense. I see. It spawns in the spring because of this. So these basic dynamics can and should be used in the communication of science, and yet they aren't. So towards this end, we're going to do a little exercise here, which I just did last Thursday for the first time in a workshop and worked really nicely, which is I'm going to have a few, quote, volunteers tell the beginning of a story. Can we get somebody with the microphone ready to have these volunteers use it? So, okay, you're ready. So let me start off with, this is how a story begins. So this morning, I went for a walk. I saw my neighbor, waved to him. Across the street, saw another friend walking his dog, rounded the corner, and out from behind a car, a guy stepped out and pointed a gun at me. That's the beginning of a story. Everything else was the normal world, and then suddenly something happened that threw us into this abnormal world, this special world. So I have asked 3 volunteers, quote volunteers, to tell us the beginning of a story just as concisely, starting with Becky. And here's Becky. So tell us the beginning of a story. Short and simple.
Very simple. I was raised on the coast of the South China Sea, and my sisters and I, as little girls, would
Oops, is this microphone on?
Hello, hello. Can you hear me now?
Microphone.
Can you hear me now? No. Come stand by you. Okay, as a little girl, my sisters and I, raised on the South China Sea, used to cross a very flimsy bamboo bridge to get to an island. And we were told that we had to be careful because the mermaids would grab our ankles. And that's exactly what happened with my sister Liz. Her ankles got grabbed, and down she went. But she's alive.
That's an interesting story. It was supposed to be based in real facts and science.
It was real.
Wow. Okay. Well, she'll be around later. You can get the rest of the story. So do we have that one microphone working somewhere? This one? And now we had Greg was going to tell us a story. Greg, are you there somewhere? Yes. Okay. Here, bring a microphone. I'm here. Oh, thank you. Hopefully that one works. Same thing, nice and short and simple.
Oh, that one works?
Testing. Does this? Can you hear?
Yes. Yes. The story begins.
In the late 1970s, myself and 3 or 4 guys went to Alaska, bush flying fishing expedition, and
short and simple.
It's almost done. And we all had our fishing rods, and one guy also had a very high-powered rifle with him, and he liked to go and fish by himself, and he would just take the rifle on his shoulder, and that's the only place we ever saw it. At one point, he came back down from a stream. Nobody was there. We'd been flown in. He came back down from the stream, and his fishing rod was where his rifle should have been, on his shoulder, and his rifle, the powerful one, was in his arms, and he was ready to shoot.
Perfect. There, perfect, okay. So he set up the ordinary world, they're out there, usual sorts of things, and all of a sudden one day the guy's showing up with this rifle, and the third start of a story is going to come from Nancy Knowlton. And, oh, is that working? Maybe the other microphone?
Hi, yes.
Okay.
I think it's on.
Okay.
So I used to work in Panama, on the coast of Panama in the San Blas Islands, and I was in the San Blas Islands with my daughter and a bunch of other people doing our normal thing, and a couple of the students wanted to go back to the Panama City, so they went off to the airport. We thought everything was fine, but then they came back and said, something's wrong, we can't get to Panama City. There seems to be some trouble in Panama City, and then pretty soon thereafter, a large Cayuca boat with about 12 heavily armed Panamanian soldiers arrived at our island and said, "You're coming with us."
Perfect. There we go. Same deal. Ordinary, normal world, and all of a sudden, these guys show up with guns and say, "You're coming with us." There you go. That's the basics of starting a story. And one of the best things you can do with communications is, I mean, it's nice to watch really good communicators and great movies, but one of the better exercises is to watch really boring presentations, really boring speakers, boring documentaries, and start asking yourself, what's wrong here? Why is this so boring? And a lot of the times, there's no question that's been posed. It's just ambling information, exposition. So the thing I ask of all of you, especially you youngsters here, for the rest of your life, remember that a story begins when something happens. And so many people think they're telling a story, and they're not. And it's so important because it's so powerful. And you can see all three of these stories, you're going to want to call up these people afterwards and ask them, so what happened? You know, you've been left in suspense. It's amazing. I just randomly grabbed the three of them. All three of them have great stories. So that's, you know, we can call that the science of communicating science. That is actual theory and structure. And when you go to Hollywood and you start working on big movies, you wouldn't believe how much science they have behind those great big movies. There's a lot of theory and all of this sort of structure used very much. And a second thing that's important in this communication today is the ability then to shrink things down, like I was already badgering all three of them. Come on, faster, faster, faster. We live in this world that is accelerating, and just to give you some proof of that, let me tell you something that just hit me last year. I went and saw this movie, Contagion, with Gwyneth Paltrow and a bunch of other stars in it, and something hit me when I saw this movie. So I went home and chose two fairly representative movies of similar sort of genre from earlier in time, and measured two variables. This is the one piece of science I'm going to present to you. The first one was a movie called Airport in 1975, an action movie back then. And here's the first variable, which is the total length of the movie, 136 minutes, more than 2 hours. And this is the amount of time it took them to start the story for something to happen. So in the case of this movie Airport, for 84 minutes, more than an hour, basically nothing was happening. Burt Lancaster was agonizing about his career. The local people were protesting the airport construction. Dean Martin was chasing after stewardesses. On and on and on. It was like you're sitting there, what? I know, but what's the point of all this sort of stuff? Finally, at 84 minutes, they find out there's a man on the plane with a bomb. Now we've got a source of tension or conflict. What's going to happen? Is the plane going to blow up? So then we jump to 1995 with the movie Outbreak, that's about a virus. We see the movie's already shorter. It's only 127 minutes. And the story begins there in 23 minutes. The movie opens with some stuff in Africa, kind of background stuff, and then Dustin Hoffman and Ray Russo, their marriage is falling apart. And then finally at 23 minutes, Dustin Hoffman is in the containment unit in his security suit, and he looks down and sees there's a rip in there. He's been exposed to the virus. Now we've got a story. Is he going to die or not? Then we jump to last year with Contagion, and take a look at this. The movie is only 106 minutes long, and the story begins in the first frame of the movie. Gwyneth Paltrow sitting on a plane, pouring with sweat because she's infected with the virus already. We've already got the story up and going. This is a reflection of our society today. Last year at Book Expo, they had a panel with 4 editors of major novels, and at the end they said, what do you see as the single clearest trend for the future? And they all said, in the future, instead of starting your murder mystery on page 40 and finding the body, you're going to have to find the body on page 1. You've got to start immediately, because people's attention spans have gotten shorter. You've got to get the story up and running. So towards that end, you got to get to the point. And now let me tell you about who I think is probably the most powerful authority and resource on this topic. And it's not this guy, but this guy, Trey Parker, the co-creator of the animated series South Park. And last year, they had, on Comedy Central, they did a half-hour show on the making of South Park. And in the middle of it, they cut to him talking about his process in writing the script. And listen to what he says here. It's only a 40-second clip, but let me show this to you. It's the second part of what he's talking about. When he talks about his rule of replacing that's relevant and important.
This is going to end up being about a 40-page script, I think, which just means it just becomes brutal because you have to go back in tomorrow and start, as you're coming up with new stuff, and you've got to start taking scenes that are there and figuring out, okay, how can we make this same thing happen in half the time and rewrite it? And I sort of always call it the rule of replacing ands with either buts or therefores. And so it's always like, this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. Whenever I can go back into writing and change that to this happens, therefore this happens, but this happens, whenever you can replace your ands with buts or therefores, it makes for better writing.
This is one of the most powerful and simple things in communication I have ever heard. And replacing ands with buts and therefores. First off, why in the world would it come from this guy? Why wouldn't it come from somebody with a Ph.D., a communications theorist, a linguist? And the answer is, we can divide communication into 2 parts. The cerebral part up here, all the informational stuff, and then the visceral stuff, the stuff that's more experiential, that you have to kind of go out and done. Trey Parker doesn't have a whole lot up here. You know, he just got an undergraduate degree, never did any graduate work. But down here, experientially, he's had 15 years of telling stories week after week after week. He knows through practice how to make a story work. And this ends up becoming his little rule of thumb that he spits out of all of it. Replacing ands with buts and therefores, let me tell about how that works. So I was talking about the 3-act structure here, beginning, middle, and end of a story. We start off with this exposition, we pose a question, and then answer. And at the end, after you've answered the question, you earn the right to synthesize what it is you're talking about. This is where you get to deliver your big message and pontificate. Well, the word and turns out to be your expositional word. When I'm going to tell you a bunch of information, I'm going to tell you, I took a walk this morning, and I saw a guy, and I saw a neighbor with a dog, and. And this ends up being the problem with so many scientists. When you think about this, the next time you go to a science meeting, you start listening to these scientists giving their talks. They never get beyond this word and. They say, you know, we're doing a study, and here's our equipment, and here's our experiments, and here's a graph, and here's a graph, and here's a graph, click, 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 click. And everybody falls into this whole mode where they're all nodding off to the and. But this is what you want to get to. But is the word that starts the storytelling process. It changes the direction, it establishes conflict. And think about what he said there. He goes back into the script, and the script is kind of dull, and every time he changes an and to a but, suddenly he's added a little bit of tension or conflict, and therefore is a word that then brings things together. It synthesizes it all. So I could talk about the research in my laboratory. We are studying cell physiology and biochemistry But we've realized we can't answer the questions we're interested in without getting into molecular biology. Therefore, we're now doing molecular work. It's a simple way to shrink down the entire giant body of what you have for a message into one sentence. And for years, people have talked about this thing called the elevator pitch, which is this idea of if you end up in an elevator with some important person, you're going to get the time between 8 floors to make the pitch to them, explain to them what it is that you do for your project. You need to have it all shrunk down. Well, as far as I can tell in all the books that I've looked at and the websites, no one ever offers this narrative structure for what an elevator pitch is. They always talk about it needs to be concise and punchy, and you got to be enthusiastic. But this is an actual structure. This is the science of communication. And this begins to address this question again of, can scientists be good storytellers? Can they shrink their big message down like this? And this is the core of my book. What I learned in my acting class was this one simple principle that our acting teacher told us night after night. And acting and communication, by the way, are one and the same. And for any of you who are interested in this topic of communication, best thing you can do is take some acting classes. Don't read a book on acting. Go take an actual class, because they're the same process. And as I said before, it's not a coincidence that our president that came to be known as the great communicator was himself an actor. So what this teacher would say to us night after night is that when it comes to reaching the entire audience out there, you have 4 organs that are important in your body. Not just your head, but your heart and your gut, and even the sex organ sometimes. The object of reaching everybody is to do something more than just your head, because that's all the information, the cerebral stuff. You need to come down and sometimes use your heart with some emotion, sometimes your gut with humor and intuition, and rarely even the sex organs with sex appeal. So it's about these 4 organs, and this became the core of the first chapter of my book. I used this photograph of this guy, the bodybuilder, to illustrate it with Arnold Schwarzenegger. And now I have constructed over the last couple years this workshop where I now work with 2 other professionals from Hollywood, and this is the way we break it down. We just did this last Thursday in San Francisco with the Natural Resource Defense Council. I call it the S-Team, and I provide the overview, the guy with the science and filmmaking background, and then I bring in a script writer, Dory Barton, who's also an actress, and she provides the cerebral part of the equation. And I bring in an improv instructor, Brian Palermo, from the Groundlings Improv Comedy Theater, and he does activities and games, improv games, that are about tapping into spontaneity and helping you to think less and act more, come down out of your head and tap into this more visceral region. And together, they provide the whole spectrum of training for communications, and that's where we're working on it now. And just 2 more things to run through here, getting near the end. This topic of the science of science communication. So 2 months ago in Washington, D.C., National Academy of Science put together a 2-day conference on science communication, but more specifically about the science of science communication. And the idea was to bring in all those very cerebral people, all the Ph.D s, the linguists, the communications theorists, the semioticians, yada, yada, with the hope that science alone could enable us to figure out how to communicate effectively. That we could solve all these equations and presto bingo, here's the way you put your words together, and as soon as you say them in this order, everybody's going to understand what you have to say and they love you. Well, there's certainly that part of it as I'm talking about the science of science communication, but here's the most fascinating thing that happened at this big meeting of there, was they brought in this extra special guy, Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, as their keynote speaker. And I think they thought that he was going to say, you're right, science can solve everything. But at the end of his keynote address, which was posted online, it's an hour-long talk, and it's really not a very compelling, fascinating talk, but the last thing he gets to is talking about this subject of communicating climate change, and he says, here's the deal. When it comes to getting the public motivated, interested in this science of climate change, here's his actual words. The source of the message is extremely important. The source has to be liked, and the source has to be trusted. And if the scientific establishment is not trusted, then the amount of evidence is really going to have very little purchase on what is going to happen. So these 2 elements, being liked and trusted, these are not about information. It doesn't matter how you get your facts put together, how much information you got. If people don't like you, if they don't trust you, they're not going to listen to you, and you're never going to get anywhere. And it's really ironic, because what he said to them in the end is that the answers for you now lay down here in this lower part. These are more visceral, more human things that you learn from the humanities more than from the world of science. And that's part of the conundrum. And so the last little thing that I want to present to you here is on this topic of the difference between information up here and emotion that resides down here in your heart and your gut, which is very, very hard to tap into, and yet we know is the most powerful tool for broad communication. So I've made 2 movies that I told you about earlier, and now this year we're finishing, actually in 2 weeks, my new documentary feature film that we'll be submitting to film festivals. And this is a movie about the last surviving officer of the Bataan Death March in World War II. He's 94 years old today, and he's also my father. And it's a very complex story about a man who walked out on his entire family at age 71 after 42 years of marriage, and trying to figure out what went on with this guy, and to try and understand that, going back into the past and learning what happened to him on the Bataan Death March and in Japanese prison camp. And I brought out I tracked down 7 of the last survivors, all in their 90s, who all were on the Death March and ended up in prison camp. So at the core of this whole set of experiences is what happened on the Bataan Peninsula in World War II. In the Philippines. So on December 7th, as you all know, Pearl Harbor was attacked. The next day, the Japanese invaded the Philippines islands, and they came down and they circled the Bataan Peninsula eventually, and 25,000 American troops were caught there, 12,000 on Bataan, 12,000 on Corregidor. And what I knew going in, having looked at a bunch of films and read all about this, was that the story of what happened to Bataan, the core element in that story, the core emotion, was the experience of abandonment. These men got caught there, and they kept hoping that the U.S. would send reinforcements to save them, and it never happened. They got abandoned, and eventually the U.S. said, "We're sorry, we're caught up in the war in Europe." And they were just given up on, and then had to surrender eventually, and that's why they went to prison camp. So I knew it was about abandonment, but the key thing is, you need something more than just those facts, that information. Can you tap into the emotion? These guys are still alive, and they still feel bitterness from back there. And how can you tap into that emotion? And one of the things I'd learned from this acting training in particular was that once you start to sense that emotion, you've got to go in and find the specifics, because the power of storytelling rests in the specifics. So what happened was, the first 3 of these old guys that I interviewed, I asked them about this abandonment thing. I said, what did you feel? Tell me about it. And they were all very general, and general is not very powerful for storytelling. They would say, well, they weren't sending us food, and they kept saying they were going to send us reinforcements, and I know, but when? Who told you this? What day? How did it happen? And they were all so vague, and I wasn't getting anywhere until finally the 4th guy, this guy, well, it's kind of dark there, but you could hear it on the, can we turn the lights off for this last little bit here? Somebody, how do we turn this light off so I can, at least there. And so I kept pushing him and saying, I know, but what was the day that you realized that you'd been abandoned? What was the hour? What was the minute that it came to you? And finally, he looked up with his eyes wide, and he said, I got it. I know when it was. It was the morning of Sunday morning, February 23rd, 1942. We were out in the jungle, huddled around the radio, listening to President Roosevelt's fireside chat. And in that fireside chat, he basically dropped the bomb on all the troops and said, there never was a plan to send reinforcements. We couldn't get there if we wanted to. The Japanese blockade is so extensive. We're sorry, but there comes a time in war where men have to be abandoned. And that was the moment. And we tracked down that audio, and in the movie, then we play the audio back and let these guys listen to it. And when you look at, you just watch their faces as you're hearing this audio, and you could see the emotion in their faces of these men who went through this, and all of them abandoned. And when we finished our test screening 2 months ago, big audience, one of the guys said, he's a former Marine, he said, I've watched every movie on Bataan. This is the first time I've gotten it. I've understood what they went through, why they're still bitter to this day. It's the first time I felt the emotion. And that's at the core of this communication stuff, is that we're awash in a world of information today, and we can't figure out why people don't want any more information. But the one magical power tool that we have is emotion, but it's really, really hard to find it. And you have to just get in there and keep digging and digging and know that it's there and pushing people, and people don't want to share emotions. But once you finally get there, that's kind of the communications gold. And to bring it all back full circle, it is this difficult and important of a challenge. This is our president now, and he has been told 2 weeks ago that he may lose his re-election this fall because he failed to do this. He did not tell stories. He did not figure out a way to be compelling, and it's a shame because once upon a time, he did do this in his election campaign, and when he faced the Reverend Wright scandal, he pulled his entire campaign out of the gutter in a single evening with a single speech that was highly emotional and energized, where he threw all the cards on the table, and he's got that ability. But once he got into the presidency, he shifted from out of his heart up into his head, and he's been a very cerebral president, and he's made all these great accomplishments, but now he's got to figure out a way to come down out of his head into his heart and his gut and figure out a way to get this across to the public, and if he doesn't, probably won't get reelected. So same thing faces the science world, especially in this issue of communicating climate change. All the scientists know this is a crisis, and yet they're failing to get it across to the public, and that's why we have no major legislation. So that's what we face today. I hope that makes some sense, and let's have some thoughts and questions and things like that. Yay. Thanks.
Finish the story.
Yeah, exactly. All three of them are amazing stories. There's your storytelling dynamic right there. You know, you don't want the person to leave until they finish the story. Yes, shout it out. Or yeah, well, I guess we got microphones. They want you to speak into.
Do you need the microphone?
Oh, I think they want it for recording for their video.
I don't know if it's any better or not. I'm a retired middle school teacher. I agree with everything you've said, and I think part of the problem is that in education, the teachers in the educational profession does not follow the storytelling routine, which is dull and boring, and this is why American education is in deep doo-doo today.
Thank you very much. All right. That was my message delivered a little more bluntly. Great. Other thoughts, comments, questions, disagreements, stories that you want to tell? Confusion.
Hi, thank you. That was a great talk. I wonder what you might say about the use of storytelling when you're using scientific information in business, where it's a bit of a different field. I wonder if you could speak to that at all.
Using storytelling skills in communicating science to the business community, basically. It's, you know, the thing about storytelling is you begin to realize it's universal. And these basic principles, and again, you know, it's as simple as this idea of grabbing interest with a question, leading us on some sort of journey that engages us, and then paying it off with an answer at the end. And I get this a lot from scientists in particular, which is they don't want to do this, you know, and it takes a lot of energy, a lot of time, effort, and energy. In fact, let me show you one little slide here. You know, this is the basic process that you go through with storytelling, is you go out in the real world and you gather this information, and it begins as a square plug. And everybody in their heads have got these round holes as receptors for good stories. The question is, can you hone this square plug into a cylinder so it slides smoothly into somebody's head and they actually enjoy feeling go in there? Or are you going to just keep it as a square peg and just pound it into their head? And, you know, have you ever been at a presentation that you felt like, you know, having a square peg pounded into the round hole in the side of your head? I hate to say this, and it's going to offend a significant number of you, but tragically, the single most important environmental issue of our day was communicated to the biggest audience in a movie that was basically this. So Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth, was made very quickly in the fall of 2005 because the people behind it thought it was a crisis, and they didn't take the amount of time needed to shape it into a cylinder. It doesn't tell a story. It's not a watchable film today. It's not enjoyable because there's no story there, because it takes time to develop a good story. How do I know it takes time to develop a good story? Here's another little anecdote for you. Oops, let's see here. Where is that? This guy is another one of these veterans in my movie, and he's 90 years old. A little over a year ago, I went to interview him, having no idea what I was getting into. The guy took us in his backyard, pulled up a lawn chair, we set up the camera, and it wasn't even an interview. He just, as soon as we turned the camera on, he took off for an hour telling these stories of what went on in Bataan and Corregidor in the Death March, and boom, boom, boom. The stories were unbelievably compelling and interesting and perfectly structured. They had a setup, they grabbed your interest, they posed a question, followed you along the journey, paid it off over and over again. When it came time to edit the movie, with this guy, all we have to do is just cut the start and the end and drop his little stories in there. He's an amazing storyteller. But at the end of an hour then, I said, now let me ask you a few questions. And I asked the first question, and what came out was nonsense. And that night, driving home, I was thinking this through, and I began to realize these stories that he told in the first hour, these are stories that he's been telling for 70 years. He's been honing and shaping them. He's told them at 1,000 cocktail parties. He's realized that when he told the story and went off talking about the truck that was parked over here, everybody glazed over and got bored, so he got rid of that part. But when he told about the bomb going off, everybody was intrigued, so he expands that out, goes into more detail. That's story development. This is what they do in Hollywood on scripts for years, getting them into a shape that really works. And eventually, you have compelling stories. But for the most part, they don't happen overnight. And therein lies the challenge, especially for scientists. They're not interested and willing to invest the time to develop stories like this or even believe in the process. But I promise you in the near future they will, because things are changing and they're having these communication crises. So that's what's at the core of it. So to bring it back to your question about the business world, it's the same basic dynamic. And Joseph Campbell's book, The Hero's Journey, talks about how it just pervades our lives. We all live our lives as stories. In fact, you reflect back on your life in the form of a story. So it's everywhere, and it's just the best way to draw people's attention and interest in. Yeah.
What do you think about Rachel Carson as a storyteller?
Well, there you go. You know, why was Rachel Carson so? You said it in the introduction. You know, you're already telling the whole story of what I had to say. Rachel Carson and Jacques Cousteau were both very good story. Think about the two parts that I ran through here. I ran through the cerebral stuff, which is the story structure, the and, but, and therefore, and how you structure into 3 acts. That's the informational stuff. So they both had a good enough instinct about that. But more importantly was they were both well-versed in the humanities, and that gave them the ability to move this stuff down into something more than just information, down into their heart with some emotion. And you know, Jacques Cousteau made the whole world fall in love with the oceans. How did he do that? When you look at his things, they were infused with the sense and feeling of mythology and literature and all these things. He would go and do all this archaeology. And so he was as much enraptured with the humanities as he was with science. And people to this day assume that he was a marine biologist. You know, he wasn't by any stretch. He just was a spokesperson for the oceans, and he was effective because of the humanities. Again, this is the crisis the science world is facing now, is that all across this country, the science world has had its way on college campuses, trampling over the humanities. And every campus I go to, I hear these stories. History departments, English departments, all collapsing down for lack of funding, while the science buildings are being giant, you know, molecular biology centers built all over the place. Well, this is sort of the booby prize for the science world. Is great, you took over all the campuses, but now you don't know how to communicate because you failed to learn the humanities, so you're stuck with it. And I think that's really the overall lesson. Some of these science people are going to have to go back and relearn this basic stuff that was in the humanities courses. Yes?
I've interviewed quite a few scientists, and I find that there's reluctance on their part because they want their whole project to be done. They want the control group all wrapped up, and then they'll talk about it. They're not dilettantes. They're not interested in the cocktail party, braggadocio. They want it all finished, and they don't really trust the interviewer to understand. So you have to do 4 or 5 interviews to get the information. But how can you make them understand that it's important to them to share this information in a readable, understandable way?
Yeah.
That it's to their benefit.
This has to come from the leadership of the science world, for which there is virtually none. Science world does not believe in leadership, so it's a profession that flounders kind of all over the place at times. But that said, what you're talking about right there is the fundamental problem of dealing with uncertainty. And this is what comes up every time that I show my movie Sizzle, and in the discussions afterwards, people say, how do we deal with uncertainty and the future and predictions, things like that? Well, to begin with, if you're well-grounded in narrative dynamics and elements and things like that, the first thing you know is that when you read a novel, the narrator is omniscient. The narrator always has 100% certainty as telling the story. You know, this is a story of some people who took a trip to here and there and there and there. The narrator's not going to say it's a story that maybe they went here. Oh no, maybe they went here. No, I don't really know where they went. They went somewhere. That doesn't happen. So as soon as you get into anything with uncertainty, you're already violating narrative principles. And it doesn't mean you can't do that. But what it does mean is you've got to have an awareness that the greatest strength is what you can talk about with 100% certainty. And this turns into sort of positive public relations, I think, and this is my suggestion to the climate science world, is what's the deal with El Nino? El Nino is this miracle that the climate science world has brought to our society. And they don't even know it. You know, this is the problem with scientists. They don't even understand the great things that they do. In 1998, I was a professor at the University of Southern California. My intro bio course, I had a little simple questionnaire, a bunch of questions, over 100 students, and one of the questions is, what is El Nino? And not a single answer came even close to guessing it was a climate phenomenon that's caused by slowing of the oceans and all these sorts of things, brings on disasters. Today, every single undergraduate at any California college can instantly tell you El Nino is a year where we're going to get these floods and, you know, the fires and all sorts of wild things, climate stuff. More importantly, the transport industry, the agriculture, everything in the state now, thanks to climate scientists, can now, and this is what we're dealing with right now in California, is they're saying this is probably going to shift into an El Nino year. Everybody knows what that means now. That is wonderful stuff that the climate science world has brought to you. Think back to what the Nobel laureate guy said. how do you communicate effectively? You need two things, trust and likability. And there's your trust element. You build up trust from the public by letting them know, look at all the things we've done for you. And sadly, this is what the Al Gore movie should have been mostly about. It should have gone through the whole El Nino story and about, look at what the climate world has brought us. Look at how much knowledge they've got. And now we're facing this uncertainty. Maybe the last little part of this film could have been about that. But when you make an entire movie about uncertainty, we think that it could be the end of the world, or maybe not. You know, that's not going to work real well. So that's kind of a long-winded answer addressing what you're talking about there. But it's about the strength, and that's why those scientists are terrified of the uncertainty part, so they don't want to talk about anything. Whereas if they were being guided more effectively, they could at least jump into the certainty part. You know, let me tell you about the things that we do know. That's where they should go for communications, and then they should tell great stories about that. And I guarantee you there's a ton of great stories to be told about El Nino. It's just that they don't know how to go that direction. Yes?
You said that Obama is going to lose the election if he doesn't get back to storytelling. Do you think that Romney's a good storyteller?
Yeah, well, let's not politicize this discussion. I think... let me just revert back to, and this is my take on Obama, is that what I see with him was that in his election campaign, that Reverend Wright scandal came along, and everything was at stake in an instant. And what he did was he ignored all of his advisors, said, I don't want to hear the polling data. I don't want you coaching me on, you know, focus groups, all this sort of stuff. I don't want the cerebral part. I'm going with the gut instinct on this one. And he got up and he gave that tremendous speech in which he basically said, this is who I am, this is what I do, and if this isn't good enough for you, then don't elect me president. And the power and the emotion of that one speech, you know, it was heralded as one of the greatest kind of campaign speeches ever. But that showed he's got that ability to tap down into those things which connect with the whole audience, and it saved his entire campaign. I think he's facing a similar thing right now, and it's not clear whether he's got an ability to do it this time around. I mean, one of the sad things in terms of the storytelling thing is look at what he's done in saving the auto industry. That's one of his great claims to fame right now. Where's the story that he's telling about that? If it was Ronald Reagan, right now you'd be hearing the story of the Joe the plumber type guy up in Michigan whose life was falling to pieces, and now the industry, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, and that's the power of specifics and storytelling. But he's not getting coached enough in that direction, or he's just not following through his own instincts. So, yes, in the back. And I will not comment on Romney, sorry.
I don't know.
Oh,
this is working great. What led you to go to film school to make that? It seems like such a huge risk to switch from a Ph.D. in marine bio to film. What has it always been about communication abilities for you? What?
I would have to say the #1 element was fun, and you know, it was the most fun thing I ever did in my life was moving out there and going into film school. But one of the things I see in retrospect is, you know what pulled me into the world of marine biology? It was storytellers. When I was 18 years old, I dropped out of college. I ended up working on an oceanographic project in Puerto Rico, and there were 3 or 4 marine biologists there that every evening the ship we worked on, they'd sit out on the back deck drinking beers and telling these amazing stories of their travels around the world. And the stories were very cool because they weren't just tourist stories. Every story was integrated with the substance of what they were doing. They were there in Brazil to learn something as well, to study something, but then along the way they had all these crazy experiences. And you know, one of the great storytellers that I met along the way was Jeremy Jackson. And I spent a summer right before I went to graduate school in Jamaica, where there was a big lab there, and he and I sat there in the evenings with all the students, and he would tell these amazing stories. He's a great, great storyteller, as you will see when you hear from him eventually. So I see today that the 2 career pathways are unified by storytelling. Not only that, I don't see them as all that different, because what is science? In science, you go out in the real world, you gather a bunch of data, you bring it into a laboratory, and then you shape it into a story that you then write up in a paper, or you go to a meeting and you tell the story of this is what's going on with these starfish out there. Filmmaking is the same thing. You go out in the real world, you shoot some film, you come in the editing suite, you edit it together into a story, and you go and share it with an audience. So creatively, I see the 2 processes as very, very similar. I've been more surprised along the way at how similar they are than how different they are, and kind of convergent. And that's a lot of my message here, is that the communication dynamics. It's time for scientists to quit thinking of themselves as being so weird and different and unusual. And I think that's happening. I think there's a whole new youthful generation, in part because the 2 worlds are much closer together today than they used to be. Everybody's using the same types of computers, all these communication devices, so it's not as big a divide as it was. Yes, in the very back.
Hi. Sometimes when hearing a story I almost don't take it as seriously as I would if it was straight out facts. And I know that from like a student's perspective. And I was wondering how you find it better to tell stories and make them interesting, but also keep the attention on scientific topics.
Say that last part again. How to tell stories and what?
Make it like interesting, but also make people able to comprehend the scientific information.
That's, once again, the challenge is up front. It's in the developing of stories, and it's in the searching for stories. So, for example, if any of you are interested in this topic, you know, professionally, you want to get deeper into storytelling, one of the very best things I recommend you do, if you have HBO, begin watching the show HBO Real Sports with Bryant Gumbel. And that show is unbelievable. And it's unbelievable because after a while, you realize it has very little to do with sports. And week after week, there are 4 or 5 segments, and after a while, you know, you see there's a segment on the World Badminton Championships, and you say, I have no interest in badminton, but I'm going to go ahead and watch it because I know it's going to be some amazing story. And most of the stories are always these incredible journeys. And they're usually the story of some person who was at the top of their game and then got into drugs and alcohol, and now they're a disaster. Or the other way around, somebody who, you know, got in a car wreck and became an invalid and then worked their way back and now won the world championship in badminton or something like that. And the stories, you sit there and you start crying on some of them. They're so inspiring. And they begin to make you realize the power of storytelling, and it has nothing to do with the sport after a while. And you just see that they don't. But how do they end up doing them so well? Is I guarantee you they've got an enormous team of people who are out there scouring the countryside looking for these stories, and every one of those stories is real world. They don't bend anything, you know, it's just real stories. This really happened. Just 2 weeks ago, you should see the unbelievable story of Dominic Moceanu, the Olympic gymnast, and the sister that she had that was abandoned by her parents because the sister was born with no legs and was adopted by this family in the U.S. And only when she turned 16 did she find out. And the girl with no legs grew up idolizing Dominic Moceanu on TV and became a Tumblr herself with no idea that that was her sister that she was watching. It's an unbelievable story. That's what storytelling is about. Those stories are out there in the science world. If only these science communication people would believe it enough and get out there and watch HBO Real Sports a little more and understand the universality of storytelling. But what happens with scientists is they get so caught up in the science. And I watched a show about 5 years ago, developed for PBS, and it was a science magazine show, and they decided to do 4 segments in this thing. And each of the 4 segments were not based on people. They were based on, one of them was about thermophilic bacteria in these hot springs, and another one was about living in the deep sea, and they were all based on the science. Nobody cares that much about science. They care about human beings, and you have to accept that. And that's the thing the science world doesn't want to accept, because scientists are also excited about the science. They assume that everybody else shares their enthusiasm when they don't. Yes?
Why not? Scientists want to be scientists.
Yes.
So let them be the scientists, and why don't they get some spokespeople? I mean, there's you know, starving actors all over the place.
Yes.
What a great opportunity to expound upon the science, get a little, as long as somebody would get the heart of the scientist and, you know, them feel for it and let them.
Certainly true, but the thing is, and you know, I get brought into places like NASA and Centers for Disease Control. A lot of these places, the communicators bring me in because of my science background, and at times, I swear, it's like they'll fill a room with scientists, and they'll open the door, and it's like they'll give me, you know, a chair and a whip and a gun, like a lion tamer, and they'll throw me in there and slam the door shut and lock it, and like, here, you deal with these scientists because we can't deal with them. And what I tell them is that at all these institutions, the scientists are the people who carry the big stick. When a scientist writes a memo and says, we want this to happen, the communicators collapse and say, all right, it's going to happen. So they have the power because of all their knowledge and credibility. And what I'm trying to tell them is that they need to set the standards. And if nothing else, one of the things I tell them is just do the neighbor test. You know, when your communications people produce a 5-minute video about your program, get a copy of it and give it to your next door neighbor who works in a bank and knows nothing about the science that you do, and see if it puts that person to sleep. And if the person falls asleep, then come back and write a furious memo. This is not good enough. You know, this is not working. And beyond that, you could start to, and this workshop we did last Thursday, this is with 20 people with a big environmental group in San Francisco, and I told them at the beginning, you know, again, it's about these 2 elements, the cerebral and the visceral. And in a single day, you're not going to do much in the visceral part here. This takes years. Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book called Outliers, in which he said it takes 10,000 hours for most of these professionals to really get to the point where they understand what they're doing. But the cerebral stuff you can learn in an evening or learn in a one-day workshop. And if you can learn some of these basic rules of thumb, like the simple one there, telling a story, starting with the source of tension or conflict, looking at a documentary and just asking yourself, what's the question that's being asked here? And you start to realize there's nothing. This is a quote documentary where all we're doing is we're taking a guided tour. Here's this, here's this, here's this, here's this, which can be okay sometimes, but quite often, you just sit there and you bring in a storyteller, starts looking at it and says, look, like I was saying with the guy with deploying the equipment, the scientist will just describe the whole thing. The storyteller will say, look, set it up and then put your answer here at the end of the story. Everybody will sit there on the edge of their seats. So it's about having that knowledge and setting standards. Yes, back there.
I was wondering, why should a person who's not interested in science and who's not a scientist care about science communication?
Well, the topic of science communication, they wouldn't care about. That's just a bunch of principles on how to communicate. So I wouldn't expect anybody that's not in the profession to care about science communication. That's an important question that you're asking there. And that's the starting point for a lot of these things in terms of developing a story is, what do people care about? Why should they care about this? And you get this all the time when you're writing a research proposal. It's the starting question. Why should we care about your research on these crabs that live down in the rocks there? And you have to come up with an explanation. And, well, the reason is, that these crabs could feed the world someday. And we've got to understand what's going on with them. So that is the standard question, is why should people care? But the topic of science communication is really just a whole process. It's not really. Do you have a more detailed aspect of that you were wondering about?
Well,
tell me more of what you're thinking.
If you think of a person whose profession is say, philosophy.
Yes.
Why would they care about scientists who are trying to communicate?
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. Well, no, that's really good. And so, someone who's involved in the trade itself, first off, should have some appreciation that the goal of the science is to improve the trade, basically, to make things as healthy and sustainable as possible. And therefore, the ability to do that is going to require that the scientists get this public to understand what it is they're doing and support it, because you need the support to do these things. So the crucial part in that is the communications part. And you see a lot of programs that end up losing the support of the public, losing their funding because they fail to communicate. In fact, 3 years ago, I was brought in by a thing in the center of California called the CalFed Science Project. There's 1,000 scientists that are all working on these two rivers there that convene all the problems associated with them. And they had an annual conference. And the state of California, since the mid-90s, has been giving them a huge budget, millions and millions of dollars to do this work. So they brought me in to speak to them about this stuff, communicating through film. And the night before their big meeting, we went to dinner, and one of the people said, do you know why we've invited you here? And I said, because you paid me some money. They said, no, because all of a sudden 3 years ago, the state legislature started cutting back our money. And we finally last year went and met with some of these legislators and said, why are you cutting our budget back? And they said, because nobody of our constituents has any idea what you're doing with this enormous amount of money that we're giving to you. You haven't communicated to the public. And so they quickly put together their first brochure. They had me come in and talk to them about how to make a video. And it's 3 years later, and I just last week heard from a woman, the whole program now is in tatters. It's had their funding cut so much because they failed to communicate. So that's what I would say, I guess. I hope, does that make some relevance to what you're asking? Is that like the fishermen, they benefit from the knowledge of the science that helps them manage the fishery, and the ability to do the science requires getting the public to support that. So it's kind of like a chain reaction, I think. Yes. Oh, yes. Question here. Right. Into the microphone, if you can.
Yeah. Should I just talk loud?
Sure. Why not?
So.
Yes, you can stand and talk that way, and I'll hear you. I'll stand over here.
Microphone.
Yes.
So I heard you mention that you've gone to a few workshops talking to scientists, and I was just wondering if you're thinking about kind of taking this idea of storytelling as kind of a learning tool, because kind of looking at the thing that you talked about, Joseph Campbell and everything, I've kind of realized that for a lot of kids, the teachers that really get to kids on a level where they can get away with assigning these kind of big works, or these teachers that can tell a story and really kind of make it interesting. And I was wondering, I heard you mention how you do kind of workshops with scientists, and I wonder if you did anything else, because it really kind of project here and seeing how the teachers that kind of kids like and how that everyone else likes are the ones that tell stories and make it kind of hold by information to all the.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I discovered the same thing. Actually, when I got out of film school, I still taught it at University of Southern California for a few years. And there was one day, they had me teaching the introductory biology course, freshman bio, which was 500 freshmen in this giant Bovard auditorium. And I talked them into buying an enormous screen for all my slides that I had from all my years of marine biology. And so I would give these lectures, and when I was talking about plant diversity and mushrooms and everything I didn't know anything about, my lectures were really kind of lukewarm, pretty lousy. But then when I'd get to talking about coral reefs and marine biology, my home turf, I could start telling these stories of things that I really went through. And there was one Friday, I remember, like the last story of the day was about the mission that we did living in an undersea habitat. We're down there living 60 feet down for 8 days. And on the last night, 2 of the scientists went out, and one guy who was studying octopus found this big octopus out on the sand flat, and he held it up for a picture, and the octopus suddenly started climbing up onto his head and tearing his mask off, and he started fighting this thing, and eventually it clamped down and it bit him right on his wrist and injected poison into him. By the time he came back to the habitat and swam in there, he held his wrist up, and it looked like somebody put a golf ball under his wrist there. It was incredible. And as I was telling that story with these slides, all of a sudden I hit this moment where I looked out at these 500 students and realized they were just like hypnotized. And you could have heard a pin drop, and it's exactly what you say. You know, really good storytelling is hypnotic, and people have a natural instinct for it or don't. I mentioned the video I did with the lobster fishermen. Those 2 guys are natural-born storytellers. I met with and interviewed probably 15 or 20 other lobster fishermen on the coast of Maine and New Hampshire, and none of them were like them. In fact, we were about to give up on the thing, and then people kept telling us, these 2 brothers in Stonington are amazing. Stevie Robbins, just incredibly charismatic. And then we went up there and we spent this whole evening having them tell the stories, and you see that natural storytelling ability. And that's part of what you're talking about with different teachers, is that natural ability to tell stories. Some people have got a little bit better than others, but it's something that they should be reinforcing. And you can learn a fair amount of it. You can't learn it from 0 to 100, but you can definitely learn some of these basic principles. And doing these sorts of workshops, and do you make videos? Not yet. In the future, everyone will make videos. And when you're making videos, there's like 2 steps. You know, step 1 is you just shoot a bunch of video and you glue it all together, and you're proud of yourself and saying, look, I made a video. And that's what the scientists are still at that stage. Step 2 is after you get to the point you realize, okay, you made a video, but it's kind of boring. Then you start to realize, let's make a video that actually has a structure to it and tells a story and a point and will hold people in there. And then eventually someday you make a whole big movie and it's got all that structure. So it's part of the process. I encourage you to get deeper into it. We can talk about it some more. Yeah. Okay. Great.